bachelor's degree at SUNY there at Syracuse. And so that's where I started my career. Actually, my brother has some forest land in Steuben County, and I have about 128 acres there that a lot of my practice here in forestry and vegetation management and using herbicides is actually implemented on our own ground there. So some of my practical experience comes from working on our own property. So anyhow, this presentation hopefully will answer a lot of your questions about herbicides and kind of introduces you to that topic. And as Peter said, as we go through there, if you have some questions, feel free to type them in. If there's something that you need clarification on right away, we'll try to address that. But if not, we'll try to hold the questions till the end and get to those as we can at the end of the presentation. So forest vegetation management using herbicides. And here's what we plan to cover today. We'll introduce you to the concept of competing plants and what they are, what the problems, the issues, concerns that they cause, a little bit of background as to why there's such a problem today. We'll talk about control, and we'll start with what we call integrated vegetation management, and then we'll focus in on chemical control, and we'll spend the remainder of the presentation talking about forestry applications of herbicides to manage and control vegetation, forestry herbicide application methods, and then herbicide usage and specific applications in forestry. And I think that's where I'm going to keep it very general, but I think there may be some specific questions that we can address from there. So let's go ahead and get started here. Competing plants. So we talk about vegetation management. We're primarily talking about controlling plant competition. Plants compete with each other for many different resources such as light, moisture, nutrients, space, and they limit many different things. And I list a number of them here. Limit regeneration development. So when we're looking at regenerating our forests, competing plants can limit and interfere with that development, the germination, development, growth of regeneration. Limit species diversity. We're always looking to grow and manage diverse forests to protect us from insect and disease issues. And when we have severe competing plant problems, we can really have a limited amount of diversity out there. Limit future timber potential. So if we're looking at growing quality timber of diverse species, of valuable species, competing plants can interfere with that potential. And lastly here, I've put up here, limit wildlife habitat diversity. In many instances, in fact, in the photograph that you see right there below the words, we have very limited diversity, habitat diversity there for wildlife, and species that would utilize such an area would be very limited. And we'll show you a lot of different examples today. These are principally photographs that I've taken throughout Pennsylvania. I would say they're very applicable to many different places from where I see our audiences joining us from. So we'll see how things progress here. So competing plants interfere with the establishment and growth of desirable tree seedlings, primarily by casting dense shade on the forest floor. I'm going to grab our pointer arrow here. And if you look through the background here, this is a dense understory of beech root suckers and striped maple saplings, and you can see the dense shade that's created in the background here. So when we have these kinds of conditions, particularly when we're looking at establishing desirable regeneration tree seedlings back in here, they just are not able to develop in such dense shade. And if you look in the foreground here, we see some fern developing out in this region. This was taken early in the growing season, and by the middle of summer, this fern may be 2 feet high and also casting dense shade on the forest floor. And I'll show you another image that illustrates that a little bit better as we progress here. So we're looking at what we might also call interfering plants. So plants that interfere with the development, the regeneration, or the germination, the development, and the growth of these desirable tree seedlings. So we also call competing plants interfering plants. I'm going to go through some common competing plants, and these may or may not be common to your area, but I'd say most of us are dealing with similar species. The first one that I have here is American beech, and as a result of beech bark disease and harvesting, we have a proliferation in many cases of American beech root suckers and sprouts in our understories. So that's one you may recognize. Another one is striped maple, another species that may be very abundant in our understories and a severe competing plant. Hay-scented fern. We have some beautiful fern understories here in Pennsylvania, north central Pennsylvania and northwestern Pennsylvania in particular. I'm also seeing some of this in the Catskill Mountains in New York and in the Adirondack region of New York as well, where we have what we call rhizomatous ferns, or ferns that spread by a rhizome and send up a single frond. That would be hay-scented or New York fern. And then here's another one, bracken fern, which is another species of rhizomatous fern that can just take over understories under the right conditions. Some grasses and sedges can also be considered competing plants. One grass that I've heard noted was there is a grass called short husk grass that we have on the Allegheny National Forest area. But another grass that we're dealing with, I'm not sure it's spread farther north yet, but in Pennsylvania we have an invasive grass called Japanese stilt grass that is becoming a severe problem in some areas. Blueberry or vaccinium species. This is a low bush blueberry that's just completely taken over the understory in this photograph. Mountain laurel. We have a lot of mountain laurel in places that can be competing or interfering with what we're trying to establish, what we're trying to grow. Grapevine. Grapevine can be severely damaging as it climbs across the crowns of trees. With snow and ice damage, it can break and bend a lot of new saplings and pole timber sized trees and compete for sunlight. So grapevines need to be addressed. Japanese barberry and other invasive plants that we're dealing with now. This is understory. You see the Japanese barberry in the background there. Very common across many parts of our state here in Pennsylvania. And all of those we've talked about so far, we didn't really look at quality or undesirable and poor quality trees, but we can also look at these species here. And the form and the quality and the species of something like this, we can also consider as a competing plant that is going to limit what may be able to grow in this particular area. So these can also be considered as competing. Maybe they're not going to meet our objectives for management and need to be removed in some way. So also can be considered competing as well. So let's try to understand this competing vegetation problem a little bit better. So then I ask a question here. Why are these plants such a problem today when they weren't at the turn of the last century? So as many of you may know, the history of our forests, late 1800s, early 1900s, we had very heavy harvesting that occurred. And the forests that we see today are the result of what regenerated back then. Many of our forests are in that 80 to 120 years of age. So how did those forests regenerate and bless us with the resource that we have out there? When we look at what we have and what we're harvesting today, we're kind of writing this new history on the landscape, and we're dealing with many of these competing plants, this competing vegetation that wasn't a problem back then. So here's some of the issues that we're dealing with that may be different. So it results from number one, shade tolerance, and we'll get into each one of these in some detail. High deer impact, poorly executed harvest, and exotic and invasive plants. So let's look at each one of these a little bit closer and try to understand how these characteristics influence the amount of vegetation that we consider competing in our forest today. So number one, shade tolerance. Most competing vegetation is considered shade tolerant. They grow and they develop and they do just fine in shady understory conditions. So if we look at things like beech, American beech, striped maple, the fern, the hay-scented fern, Japanese barberry, all those things are shade tolerant. And poorly harvested or partially harvested forests provide light conditions that foster the growth of competing vegetation. So think about how most of us harvest our forests by selecting just individual tree canopies for removal. Let in small amounts of sunlight, and we can see that in this photograph where we have just a spot of sunlight reaching the forest floor, but most of the forest remains shaded, and that's going to foster the development of plants that are shade tolerant. In those cases, we're going to be able to proliferate a lot of plants that are considered competing or less desirable. Okay, number 2. Deer browsing impact. So selective browsing by deer affects tree species composition. So keep in mind that deer are selective browsers. They browse preferentially. They have preferences, and we'll list these here. So if they can find species such as oak and sugar maple, ash, yellow poplar, those are going to be selectively browsed out of our forest first. And once those are missing, they'll move down that preference scale to ultimately where they're looking at species that are less preferred. Those are the beech, the striped maple, the ironwood, blueberry, laurel, ferns, etc. Basically everything that I showed you that was considered a competing plant. Deer browsing impacts can occur over a range of deer densities, and it's a function of deer density and landscape forage availability. So very low forage landscapes, the impact of the white-tailed deer can still be significant. So if we look at mature forest landscapes like we have in the Adirondack region, for example, even very low densities of white-tailed deer can really affect and shift species composition in those understories to those plants that the deer just don't prefer to eat. And those that they do prefer are readily browsed out of a lot of those understories, even at low numbers on those low forage landscapes. So deer, and I can't emphasize this enough, that deer browsing impacts is probably one of the most important factors that goes into the proliferation of some of these competing plants in our understories. Number 3, poorly executed timber harvest. We've probably all heard of high grading, or a lot of our cuts we refer to them as selective harvest. And oftentimes that's selecting, well, here I'll put it up there, selecting the best and leaving the rest. And I have an example here where a nice oak tree was harvested here, leaving a very poorly formed, less desirable species in its place, and a tree that I would say is really not a replacement for what was harvested there. And so we have an opportunity to remove that competition. That's certainly going to interfere with maybe something that might be more desirable to grow in that place. So high grading, oftentimes we call them selective cutting, leaves undesirable species and trees of low commercial value. And so those trees are now considered competition, and they're going to compete with maybe something more desirable that might be able to otherwise utilize that growing spot. And lastly was the exotic invasive plants. 10 years ago or 15 years ago when I was working as a service forester in Virginia, we didn't have to deal with invasive plants. Well, now all of us are dealing with invasives. No matter what kind of management work we're going to do, we're opening that window for invasive species to enter our properties, to interfere with our objectives. Our property in Steuben County up in New York State, same thing. Once we've started doing management work, it wasn't long before we were finding invasive plants being brought in there, and had to go and do some control work on those things. So these invasives are plants which grow rapidly, they spread aggressively, they displace our native plants, and they come in a variety of different forms, from trees, shrubs, vines, grasses, and herbaceous plants as well. And here's some of the other characteristics. Some of these I mentioned here, but they mature very quickly, produce large numbers of seeds, they sprout very easily. Their seeds, they spread aggressively over large areas by seeds, roots, shoots, and their seeds are easily dispersed from the parent plants, and most of them that I'm dealing with are spread by birds, for that matter. Some are wind dispersed, though, some are water dispersed. They're very difficult to control. They introduced either accidentally or on purpose. Many of them were planted as wildlife plants even, and we've learned over the time that It really isn't what we should have been doing. And now we're dealing with a plant that's now considered a competing plant. The Japanese barberry, like you see in this image here, you can see it in its fall coloration there, was a plant that was used widely in the landscape industry, and seeds were carried by birds and spread all through the forest. That's one that's shade tolerant, so we can have that introduced even without any kind of harvesting occurring. So how much is too much? So when is competing vegetation a problem? And I'll give you 2 points here. So the first one, when we're dealing with any exotic invasive plants, if you have any. So we need to be addressing exotics and invasives when you find one, because just by the nature of the plant and the definition of invasives, they're going to spread. They're going to spread aggressively. When you have one, you're going to ultimately have more. And the easiest time to address them from a vegetation management, from a controls perspective, is when you have one plant established out there when you first find it, rather than waiting until it's completely taken over a property and now you've got a real mess to deal with and a lot of work and a lot of expense to deal with. Unfortunately, many of us are not or don't have the opportunity to address these issues right from the very beginning. But how about some of the other plants, some of these native plants? And some of the research that was done here in Pennsylvania showed that if 30% of the more of the area was stocked with competing plants, and I'm talking things like American beech, striped maple, hay-scented fern, if 30% or more of the area is stocked with these plants or covered with these plants, then adequate desirable regeneration is not likely to develop, and competing plants are likely to dominate the understory, particularly following a timber harvest. So when you look at your understories, if you can guesstimate that you've got 30% or more of that understory covered with these plants and actually shading that ground, then you really have to look at doing some type of control measure prior to doing a timber harvest, or these things are just going to get worse and they are going to compete with whatever may try to develop underneath it. So there's the rule of thumb. 30% of there is stocked with competing plants, and we want to look at doing some type of control measure prior to doing any kind of harvest. So that gets us to control, and I'm going to introduce you to a concept of integrated pest management. But when we're talking about plants, we call it integrated vegetation management, so IVM. And you can visualize this as a pyramid with cultural control measures at the bottom and chemical control measures at the top. And as you move up that pyramid, you get into more complicated, sometimes more costly kinds of interventions. We can all implement cultural measures, and I'll go through each of these here briefly, and then we'll focus in on chemical for the remainder of the presentation. But cultural control is making the environment unsuitable for the pest. Mechanical is hand or machine removal. Biological is using natural pest controls. And then ultimately chemical is using pesticides, or in this case what we call herbicides. And so integrated vegetation management tells us that we want to use the least environmentally damaging practices, the least expensive practices, practices in combination with each other. So if we can integrate our approach and we can use a mechanical means, we can implement some cultural means, we might have to do some chemical means, but ultimately we're going to try to use these in concert with each other as often as we can to control our vegetation on our properties that we're managing. So let's look at cultural control here, and I call this indirect weed management. Indirect weed management. So we want to enhance the growth of the desirable plants through proper harvesting practice. And again, there's that deer impact that pops up again. We want to reduce the impact of white-tailed deer. We want to prevent the spread of undesirable plants. So we want to eliminate seed sources that are out there. And I'll give you an example of that. I was with a landowner here last fall, and we were seeing Alanthus or tree of heaven seedlings sprouting up in a clear cut that he had made. And he just happened to mention to me that he knew where the parent tree was on his property, and he had never bothered to control this tree. I asked him if we had some glyphosate, some herbicide in his garage, and we went down, mixed up a squirt bottle full, and went right out there and took care of the tree of heaven, took care of the ailanthus. And unfortunately, it was a female tree that was in full seed, so the seed still was out there for this current year, but we were able to eliminate the seed source for future years. So that's an easy thing that you can take care of. One of our worst problems was we used a lot of exotic plants in our plantings. So let's look at our native plants. Plant natives. Plant those that are native to your area. We can do things like reducing seed spread by cleaning equipment, stopping soil movement. To be honest with you, I'm always afraid that I'm going to introduce Japanese stiltgrass when I go up and work on my brother's property up in New York State. So I'd hate to bring that to our property, but it is literally on most places I visit here in Pennsylvania. We want to minimize soil disturbance. So all of these things, we can refer to them as cultural control practices or indirect weed management practices. Mechanical control are things like hand pulling, cutting using brush saws, chainsaws. The tool pictured here right here is called a weed wrench. Shrub honeysuckles are generally easy plants to pull, where you can get the whole root system. They root very shallow, so that's one that you can pull very easily. Or things like mowing, and this is a fecon bullhog that was used on a number of different projects here that I was involved in. Basically reduces that or eliminates that competitive advantage. But what most often happens with all of these mechanical control methods is that you get resprouting. But it does provide you a window of opportunity. It does provide you some access where you can come in there and do some other interventions. In fact, I did have a fella that was using an integrated approach where he had a brush saw similar to what you see here, but he had a backpack sprayer and had the wand tied right on to the shaft of the brush cutter here. And after he cut it, he was spraying the cut surfaces to prevent them from resprouting. So keep that in mind. Most of these plants are going to resprout vigorously following cutting. Next, we have biological controls. These are natural pest controls, so we're going to talk about insects and diseases that either we can bring in to control exotic invasives or that may be naturally occurring out there that help control some of these plants and keep them in check. So one that was discovered here in Pennsylvania not very long ago that controls tree of heaven or ailanthus was verticillium wilt, ailanthus wilt they call it, and they've seen some great success, and this may be something that we'll be able to use on many properties here and actually be able to introduce this wilt disease into any patches of ailanthus that we may have. Rose rosette disease, it's a viral disease that's transported by a tiny mite, a microscopic mite that affects multiflora rose, and unfortunately does affect some other roses as well and some other plants, but we've seen this keeping multiflora rose in check. It's not eliminating multiflora rose, but I have seen it kill plants completely. Although generally you'll get another one that seeds in somewhere to replace it, but it's definitely keeping it from spreading. In some areas I've seen some significant mortality. And then things like grazing by livestock, and I know that Pete was involved, and Penn State was involved with Cornell there on the Goats in the Woods project. So that was a project where they had meat goats in the woods to look at them and see how successful they were at controlling things like striped maple and beech brush in our understories, and then moving them into various areas throughout the woodlot. So lastly, on that pyramid, on that integrated vegetation management, we come to herbicides and chemical control. And I will say this, they're probably going to be our most productive approach. When we look at other means of control, they're economical, low risk to the environment, low risk to the user. And certainly when we look at comparison to mechanical means such as running chainsaws, I would suggest that they're much lower risk. They're effective, a lot of research and commercial applications are being done right now that we have found particular rates of application and dates of application when we can do these things and be very effective. The work that was done in the northern hardwood forests and the Allegheny region is kind of a starting point for some of these other forest types to move into, where we can do these kinds of applications. There's been a lot of work done on controlling invasive plants, so we found things that are very effective, found methods that are very effective. Selectivity. This is one where we can look at particular application methods that are very selective, and as well as particular products, herbicides that are selective, and what type of plant they'll actually control. And we'll talk some more about that. And then lastly, I put up there necessary, because oftentimes as we look through that pyramid of all those different methods of control, from the cultural to biological to mechanical, we often end up resorting to herbicide methods because they're necessary, because they give us our most successful and our most productive means of control. So here's that same understory. If you look back at this image here, if you see the fern in the understory that's being sprayed, this is that same stand of timber. Following treatment, the fern is now brown and dead. One thing I'd like to point out here is the amount of little seedlings that you see that are green that are left here, and these were underneath the fern and were actually protected from the herbicide treatment and survived the spray. But the point of this is that we want to control the competing vegetation and then let in the sunlight. You can see the stand is marked for a timber sale, but the herbicide treatment was done prior to any harvesting taking place, because once you let that sunlight in, once you get all those tops on the ground, you make the plants, number one, just explode with the sunlight that's added to it, and number two, the access is much more difficult once you have the logging debris in there. So if you're going to do these control prior to a harvest, would be the ideal time. So how are these forestry herbicides applied? And there's a number of different methods, and we're going to go through each one of these here briefly. So we'll look at foliar spot and broadcast applications, basal bark applications, axe frill or hack and squirt treatments, stem injections, and lastly, we'll wrap it up with stump treatments. Let's go through each one of these briefly for you. So foliar spot applications, these are using a backpack sprayer. We're going to try to get even coverage. We're not going to spray it to the full off, to the point that it actually is running off the foliage, but we want to get the herbicide and the product evenly distributed about the plant through a fine mist of a spray. This is very applicable for small infestations. If you have just a small spot of fern, for example, or in the other picture here on the right, this is treating multiflora rose. So spot types of applications, small infestations, I would say that every one of you as a landowner or land manager ought to have a backpack sprayer in your arsenal. We can move on then to larger types of infestations and more mechanized kinds of equipment for foliar broadcast applications. So we're looking at something like this KMC track machine that can go on steep slopes, wetter soils. It's an air blast mechanism mounted on the back here, which blasts the product, the mix out in very fine droplets at speeds even up to 120 miles per hour as it breaks into very fine particles and mists it throughout the understory. Same thing here with the backpack sprayer. This is a backpack mist blower. It's a motorized backpack, very heavy. This fellow has actually rigged it so he carries the herbicide mix here in a tank that he hangs off the front of him to kind of balance the weight. But the same thing is coming out here. It's a fine mist that he sprays. He actually uses this quite effectively for treating fern in understories, and that's a backpack mist blower. So here's a couple images showing you the air blast sprayer. So if you look here, you can see the mist coming out here. and they'll have nozzles actually that spray down directly behind it as well, but they can treat swaths from 40 to 80 feet wide depending on the density of the vegetation in the understory, and up to 20 feet high. So if you had stuff that was higher than 20 feet, you probably aren't going to get control of it with this kind of treatment. You would have to come through and follow up with some other type of treatment on other things that might be higher than that. They can treat up to 100 acres in a day if they can move through and get some production on any given day. So here's an area that was actually treated a year prior to these photographs being taken. And you can see on the right here, this was treated the following summer. So this is the first growing season following treatment. And if you look over here, you can see that dense mid-canopy layer of striped maple and American beech primarily. And you can see how dense the shade is down here that would limit or may even prevent any kind of desirable seedling regeneration. And I'll show you an image here at the end of this understory. And in one growing season, it was all this green that you see here are newly germinated tree seedlings. It was just a carpet of new germinates, and it was very heavy to black cherry actually. This is another site where we actually sprayed the fern, which was just as dense as you see right here. And again, you can see that dense shade in some of these areas that fern is casting. This is actually 2 years following the treatment, and we have had no fern reinvasion here, but you can see all the dead fronds on the ground here. And the regeneration that's coming up through there was very heavy to black cherry, but I do see some blackberry briars. I do see a yellow poplar growing here, and there were some red maples as well coming in there. So this is 2 seasons following the herbicide treatment of the fern, and just a great response to the regeneration. So we can use things like ATV and truck mounted sprayers, but keep in mind that you're going to be limited as where you can drag that hose out to. It's going to always limit your access, but they do make some great work for spraying roadsides, for spraying invasive plants that might be seeding in along the edges of your roads, or for treating around food plots and other open areas. Certainly they have some utility there. Basal bark treatments used for treating thin bark trees, generally when they're less than 6 inches in diameter. So this is a very effective treatment for treating things like American beech, for treating striped maple, for treating ironwood. This actual picture that I have here, let me go to the next one here. This picture here is actually treating red maple saplings underneath a white oak stand. So it was very heavy to red maple in the understory, and it was going to be harvested. We wanted to control the red maple so that we could encourage some oak regeneration on that site. The beauty of basal bark applications is they can be done any time of the year. You're simply wetting the lower 12 to 18 inches of the trunk completely around the tree. You're using an oil as a carrier so that it's absorbed through the bark of the tree. And as I said, it can be done any time of the year, including winter months, except when snow prevents you from spraying to the ground line there. So springtime was always a great time. When we did our beech and striped maple control on our own property, we'd always go out early spring prior to leaf out even, where we had great access and could see what we had treated. We could see through the woods real well. And it's a very good practice, very effective practice, basal bark applications. When you move to a little bit larger stems, though, you want to move to something like an axe frill or hack and squirt or stem injection. And hack and squirt is simply using a hatchet, like you see in the image here, using a hatchet to make a frill cut, which a frill cut is just a downward angled cut, which creates kind of a cupping effect to hold the herbicide. Use your squirt bottle, simply fill that cut. If it's running out the sides, you put too much in there, so just fill the cut. This hatchet you'll see is actually ground down, so the blade, and you can see it in the shadow here actually, but the blade is very narrow. That's what you want. You don't want to use something like a machete, because what's going to happen, it's going to make your cuts way too wide, and you're going to eliminate that cupping effect. and the herbicide is actually going to run out the edges a lot more. So something like this is perfect, but any kind of narrow blade hatchet is really effective in that. You can use, and as I said, this is a practice you're going to implement once you get to a little bit larger stems, because you're going to put very little product in something like this. And this is a great selective means, because the herbicide is being placed directly into the stem of that tree. Yeah, if you want to invest equipment, you can invest in something like this. This is a hypo hatchet. It actually has a port right there in the blade that when you strike the tree, there's a plunger mechanism in the back of the hatchet here that injects a certain amount out through these ports into their cuts. But you're looking at about $350 for something like this. So if you're in the business and you can pay for it, certainly that might be a tool you want to use, or an injector like this. This is about a $500 piece of equipment that injects these little capsules through the bark, and it actually sticks right in the bark of the tree, and then it's translocated by the tree. The herbicide is translocated by the tree throughout it. So that's the axe frill and stem injection process. And lastly, we'll cover stump treatments. So we're going to do stump treatments if we have to cut something down and we don't want it to resprout. So as I mentioned, a lot of these plants, when they're cut, resprout vigorously. And I'll give you a short example here. I was working with a landowner here in Pennsylvania, and he went through his woods, and he was very proud of the work he had done, but he had done some timber stand improvement work, cutting striped maple and cutting red maple down throughout his understory. Came back to show me the work, and it was months later, and we walked up into the woods there, and the striped maples had just all resprouted. So all that work that he had done, we had sprouts, multiple sprouts coming off every stump that were now 3-4 foot high just in one growing season. So all that work he had done, thinking that he had cut everything down and got that sunlight in the ground and done a lot of good, and his woodlot was all for naught because of the resprouting on those plants. So in general, herbicides must be applied to the cambium area, which is just the outer ring here around the edge. That's the cambium area. So you can see the blue dye that was put in with this mix to highlight the cambium area. And when you're using water-based herbicides, you need to make sure this is done on very freshly cut surface. So as soon as it's cut, you need to apply it. As soon as it's cut, you need to apply it. If you're using an oil-based product, you can actually come back a month later, but then you're actually treating the sides as well as that cambium layer right around the outer portion of the tree here. Okay, with the oil base, you can come back later, but then again, you got to treat the sides and that cambium ring as well. Water based, treat it when it's fresh and treat it immediately after it's cut, and all you have to do is spray that cambium layer. Okay, so here's a couple usages. Forestry and herbicide usage. So we want to increase our regeneration success. We can do things like site preparation practices. We can do release treatment. So site preparation, we're preparing the site for natural or artificial regeneration. So we're going to get natural seedlings. So we're doing that air blast treatment, for example, to control all that fern and getting that natural regeneration. And this is that understory right here. All those black cherry seedlings that germinated following the herbicide treatment. Or artificial regeneration would be preparing a site to be planted. We can also do release treatments, which is basically a treatment to reduce the competition, increase seedling growth and survival. And release treatments are often done on planted seedlings. Or if you have trees that are planted with tree tubes around them, you can spray the vegetation around the tree tube to reduce that competition, increase growth, increase survival. And then lastly, we have timber stand improvement types of practices, things like removing non-crop trees and vines. I think I showed you the image there of controlling the grapevines, for example. Pre-commercial thinning, reducing stocking levels, increasing growth rates on the trees that we're leaving, and shifting species composition to more desirable species, more valuable species, maybe better quality trees even. So we can use herbicides to accomplish all of these things, from pre-commercial thinning to release to site preparation. So many different types of timber stand improvement practices can be done with herbicides. So there's the grapevine image right there. I'm sorry. Keep in mind, this is a quote I want to share with you from Miller and Miller from 2004. The objective of herbicide use in forestry is not to achieve the complete weed control routine as in row crop agriculture, but rather to provide a temporary growth advantage, months to a few years, for the crop trees over their competition. And ideally, I would say that we're going to make one application per rotation under ideal conditions. We're going to treat our understory. We're going to treat that competing plants just like we would if we were weeding a garden. We're going to get the new seedlings, that next forest established on the forest floor. We're going to remove the overstory, and we're going to walk away until the next harvest. So ideally, that's under ideal conditions. Now we're dealing with invasives, so that often changes that picture, and we often have to make multiple entries. But under ideal conditions, and in many cases, it's one treatment per rotation, and that can be that 80-year rotation even. So wildlife and herbicide usage. So there's many different methods, not just for timber production, like I showed you there with the site preparation, release, and timber stand improvement, but also to encourage wildlife and improve habitat. So we can use it to manipulate habitat and restore native plant communities by controlling invasive exotic plants, by creating snags and down coarse woody debris. We can manage vertical cover, which is from the ground layer up to the main canopy. We can use it to manage horizontal structure across the landscape. So there's lots of different things and lots of different methods that we can apply herbicides to actually manage habitat for wildlife. So what do I use? There's a plethora of active ingredients out there. If you look at many different products that have forestry labeled active ingredients, and then it's been compounded even farther when we look at these active ingredients that have all come off patent. So now there's many different generics of these active ingredients. So I'm going to try to simplify things for you here, and we're going to try to limit it to just a few products that I think you'll be able to accomplish virtually all of your forest management objectives with. So when we're looking at foliar applications, I'm going to say with these three products, glyphosate. An example of glyphosate would be rodeo. Many of you know it through the old Roundup label. Triclopyr, an example that would be Garlon 3A. And then sulfometron methyl, an example that would be Oust XP. Those are the main products before this before these active ingredients went off patent. Again, there's many generic varieties of these, so check with your dealers, your distributors, and see what is available out there. You can check for pricing and those kind of things because they're essentially the same material. So these are the products that you can use for foliar applications. Great shrub control mix is actually a mixture of glyphosate and triclopyr. The Garlon 3A, for example, and rodeo mixture is a great invasive shrub control. So things like shrub honeysuckle, autumn olive, Japanese barberry, multiflora rose, it gives you a good broad spectrum control. Sulfometron methyl, the example, the Oust XP, gives you great control of grasses in particular. It's mixed in with glyphosate for fern control applications. It has soil activity and actually has pre-emergent soil activity, which means it actually impacts seed germination. So when we're dealing with annual grasses like Japanese stilt grass, for example, that product is one that we may have to use. Cut surface applications, we can use glyphosate again. The example of that is rodeo now. Controls numerous woody species. So when we're looking at the frill girdle, the hack and squirt, stem injection, stump treatments, all of those are different kinds of cut surface applications that we can treat that cut surface with a glyphosate product. And lastly, we have basal bark applications. So if we're treating striped maple or beech sprouts in an understory with a basal bark application, we're going to use triclopyr, but we're going to use the ester formulation of triclopyr, which is in a product. An example of that is Garlon 4. Okay, use that on thin bark trees up to 6 inches in diameter. And so there's your active ingredients. So we mentioned glyphosate, triclopyr, and metsulfur. Let's go back. Sulfylmetron methyl, which is the oust. So glyphosate, triclopyr, and sulfylmetron methyl. Those are your 3 active ingredients. And again, unfortunately, they come in many different products. And I'll show you a good resource on my website where you can look at that. So choosing the right forestry herbicide and application and method, and there's just some general guidelines to keep in mind when you're out there doing treatment. So use the most effective herbicide for controlling target species. So you can look at fact sheets, you can look at research information, but use the most effective herbicide that will control that target plant. Use the herbicide at the lowest rate that will give optimum control. Follow the prescribed application methods that are outlined. Apply the herbicide at the optimum time of year. And so I can show you some fact sheets for invasive plants, for example, that were developed here at Penn State by a fellow by the name of Art Gover, where he actually outlines the best time of year to actually apply the product to get the best control, where you can actually apply it at the lowest rate possible even. So follow all label precautions, and by all means be patient. I've seen some of these things take a full year to actually be effective. So be patient in your applications. Don't expect to see results in 1 week. So in summary, no single product or application method works on all vegetation management needs. And so we need to look at the plant that we're dealing with. We need to match that with the product and the time of year that we're going to control it. And then we'll match that up with the actual application method that we're going to use. So whether it's a basal bark method, whether it's a foliar method, whether it's a cut surface method, we're going to match that up. So check the product label for application method and rate information. So that information will be provided on the product label. So be sure to read the label and understand what it means. Select the application method that will use the least amount of product and have the least effect on the environment. So here's what we've covered just in summary. We outlined competing and interfering vegetation, selective deer browsing, and selective harvesting practices have increased unwanted plants, increased unwanted competition. So many competing plants are shade tolerant and have invasive abilities. For regeneration, treat when greater than 30% of the area is occupied by native plants. Treat invasive plants when they first appear. Chemical control is often our most productive method of control. So always read and follow the label before applying any product. So if you don't understand it, check with your county extension agent, and hopefully they can interpret that for you. I will mention this too, that the products that I've given you, those active ingredients, are non-restricted use products. So check with your department, whatever state agency governs that. But here in Pennsylvania, non-restricted use products can be applied by the landowner to their own property without certification. And so we can do all of our vegetation management work with non-restricted use products that we can take and we can apply to our own property without certification. And I always preface that by saying that we have to be able to read and understand what the label is telling us. So here's a couple of resources, and I think Pete provided you that first website there. That is my forest vegetation management website, the extension.psu.edu FVM. And then the one below that is one that has some research papers on there and some great fact sheets for controlling invasive plants. Those were the ones I mentioned that Art Gover was involved with here at Penn State. And then here's the publication, which you can access through my website there that I wrote on herbicides and forest vegetation management. And there's that link again, and I will leave that up there in case folks have other questions. But Pete, we can open it up now to take some questions. I think there were some here.
Yes, Dave, there were. We had a very good conversation during during your presentation, okay, and a lot of really good questions came up. First, that was an outstanding presentation. Thank you for that. And I think what we'll do is, as people want to type in some questions, and we'll leave Dave's contact information up there so you can capture that if you want to contact Dave directly. And let me scroll back and I'll find some of these early questions and read them to you,
Okay.
and then you can respond to those. Okay. Marge says, is there a biological control
No,
for
not that I'm
Japanese
aware of.
barberry?
No, that's one that you're going to probably need to look at a chemical means of control, Pete. I'm not aware of anything right now.
Okay. And right, nor am I. There is, I know that Jeff Ward in Connecticut had done some work with um, pairing up flame weeding control and then following it up, or brush saw control and then following that up with some herbicide treatment. So using that integrated vegetation management strategy. If you go to the Forest Connect webinar sites, Jeff Ward gave a barberry webinar presentation
Yeah,
a
it
few
is
months
easy to
ago.
control with
So you can look
herbicides,
back for
and it
that
would be a foliar type of
from
application that would
March.
be your most effective means. So full leaf out during the growing season.
Okay. Richard has a question. How would you treat a dense sapling or pole understory of beech if you aren't cutting first? So what are some, I guess, some herbicide management techniques for beech
Okay. Well,
if, when
probably
they're
the
in the
most
sapling
effective
pole
means and
size?
most cost-effective means would be to, depending on the scale of the operation and the number of acres that you're dealing with, would be to look at using the air blast mist blower. That was really the most effective tool that we have. So you would go through with that type of machinery, and again, that's going to reach everything up to approximately 20 feet in height. So there may be some stuff when you get in that pole size category of beech that you're going to miss. And so what's generally done is then to come back through with a follow-up treatment on those larger sizes where you're going to look at a hack and squirt or the frill girdle type of treatment. And so you're looking at the air blast treatment, takes out that understory, the lower layers there, and then coming back with hack and squirt or following that up with basal bark even on what was missed or what else you need to additionally treat. And the basal bark is going to be done with a triclopyr, the oil-based triclopyr. Garlon 4 is an example of the original product there. And the hack and squirt is going to be done with a glyphosate product. And the glyphosate is mixed at 50%. So the frill cuts, squirt it in the cuts, and you'll get good control that way.
Okay. And I had also posted for Richard a link. With Ralph Nyland, I wrote a beach management fact sheet. So, and I posted the link on that if people want to find that. So, all right, Jessica says, I have a very mature, 20 plus years old Russian olive border on her property. Within the next month, she's having the border cut to the ground. She wants to know if she can safely follow up the cutting with herbicides without having any negative effect on her neighbors' planted trees, particularly maples and evergreen trees. And those planted trees are
and
within
that's a
12
very
to
effective
15
means,
feet.
and that's kind of that integrated approach where you're using mowing, and then what I'm going to suggest is that you follow it up with a herbicide treatment on the resprouts. Autumn olive is one, or olive in general is one that resprouts vigorously. And so in no time, within that first growing season even, you will have vigorous resprouts off those cut stumps. But say, for example, you were to try to treat that without cutting it, you would potentially, you'd have to do a foliar treatment because you couldn't access those stems very easily any other way, and you potentially could have some overspray to some of those non-target plants, some of those planted trees that you don't want to harm. But by mowing it first, allowing it to resprout, I might even give it an entire growing season to resprout. I would come back the next spring or early summer. These invasive plants tend to leaf out earlier than most of our natives. So once they've got leaves on them, and they're fully leafed out, you can walk right down that row that you've mowed and all those resprouts. You can spot treat each one of those um, with a herbicide, a foliar treatment like a glyphosate treatment, but autumn olive isn't real effectively controlled with glyphosate alone. So that's one. If you're doing foliar treatments, you need to use the mixture with glyphosate and the triclopyr, the Garlon 3A. If you're going to do foliar treatments, now you could do a basal stem treatment on those resprouts as well. A little bit more difficult because now you're treating the sides of each stem that's sprouted up there. But triclopyr is very, very effective at controlling autumn olive. And so if you went and treated all those resprouts with a basal stem treatment, you would definitely get it in. And whether you did it foliar or whether you did it basally, on those small resprouts that now maybe are going to be 3 foot tall, you wouldn't have to worry about any overspray. But I'd give it a full season to resprout and then come back with either one of those kinds of treatments.
So Dave, would how about a cut stump treatment, this season after those olives are cut, and do a cut stump with something like either triclopyr, or if you can get to it immediately after cutting a glyphosate
probably as effective
on
if
the
you
cut
could find them.
surface.
I mean, if you were there and you cut individual plants, I was envisioning a big brush hog mower going down the row, Pete. So if you could come back and actually find those individual stumps in and amongst whatever else was harvested, maybe there's some desirable stuff there, but you'd have to be able to identify that autumn olive stump and treat it. So that's where I was getting at. I've seen some mowing done on
Right.
some large autumn olive here in one of our state parks nearby, and we actually tried to treat them as it was mowed by a large brush hog type of machine, and it was very difficult to distinguish what was desirable and what wasn't. And we found that waiting a full growing season, coming in early season the next year, those sprouts just stood out like a sore thumb because they leafed out before anything else, and we could find each one of them very easily. And so if you could identify the stumps, yeah, that would work just fine as well, Pete, and you could treat them immediately after they were cut. So if you were in there with a chainsaw, ideally you could treat them that way easy.
Okay. Right. And so good. Thank you. And one thing I hope people are recognizing is that all of these recommendations make assumptions about how they're going to be applied and the circumstances where they're applied. So people have to always kind of interject, their specific circumstances with the recommendations. Dave is here, he's there, he's in Pennsylvania, I'm in New York, and you are wherever you are, and we can't see the specific of your problem. So try to take what's here and think about your particular circumstances. And if you have questions, contact somebody that has expertise in this area. Okay, let's see our next question. Miriam wants to know if you can comment on the dye that was being used with the herbicide, and I think that corresponded with the picture you showed of the cut surface treatment.
In dye is really what you want to do because it really allows you to see exactly where that product went. Even when it's dried on the foliage, for example, you can actually see that dye. It'll still stain it slightly in the droplets. And so there's a number of available commercial dyes that you would mix in your backpack or mix in your squirt bottle sprayer if you're treating a cut stump, for example. And so whether you're doing basil bark, there's dyes that mix with oil, there's dyes that mix with water, so you got to make sure that you have the correct dye. So it's very important that you know which dye you're using and mixing, but definitely something that I would recommend. And those are available on my website. I list a number of companies that you can purchase these products from, and they would all carry that dye that you can mix in with your solutions.
Okay, and then there was Lance brought up a very good point about there's several people offering written comments, and he was just making the point that there are all states will have some level of commercial pesticide applicator licensing, and that it's important. I think what his point was, it's important to consider the source of information that you're using to make decisions, and that there are some people that will have some experiences, but but there's specialized training that's available, and people that are using these pesticides
Absolutely, yeah. And
should
anyone
seek
that's going to
good
be coming on your
counsel.
property to actually spray for you
Okay,
does
let's
need to be
see.
a licensed applicator. And so they couldn't come on and spray any kind of pesticide on someone else's property without being licensed.
Okay, Peter Howard asked the question, how much debris removal is generally required to clear the area after control? So I'm assuming there's some treatments that are made, and whether you need to manage any of the dead
Yeah, it's a good
stems that had
question and an
been
interesting
treated
thought.
by
But
the
honestly,
herbicide.
there is no debris removal necessary. And I would preface that by saying, if you're okay with looking at dead stems, some people, to them that's not aesthetically pleasing, and so maybe a cut surface treatment or a cut stump treatment might be more desirable because they don't have that dead stem standing there. Some cases it may be a hazard that you're leaving standing, so maybe you do want to cut those things down, but to establish desirable regeneration, there's no need to remove any of the dead debris. You can leave it standing if you're okay with it. And as I mentioned in the wildlife section there on that one slide there, I've actually killed trees and left them standing to create snag trees, dead standing trees, just simply for wildlife habitat. And so we're okay with leaving those standing.
Okay. Andrea says, how long would you wait after a cut stump treatment when a timber harvest is planned? So I'm assuming the time between the cut stump treatment and when the timber harvest
in that
commences.
Case, well, let me back up a minute and let's talk a little bit about cut stump treatments, because for species like American beech, and we'll talk about tree of heaven, which I don't know how much you have of that in New York State or up in the Northeast even, but I know there's a lot of it across Pennsylvania and particularly down southeastern Pennsylvania. But those are species that can vigorously send up root suckers. And so cut stump treatments are not the option of choice there, because you're essentially taking off that tree's translocation mechanism. So you're removing the top from the root system by cutting that top off. And there's very little ability then for that tree to translocate that herbicide down into the root systems or throughout the plant to control it. So if I was going to control beech or tree of heaven, because their root suckering ability, I would not advocate doing cut stump treatments. I want to leave that top attached for as long as I can and let that herbicide translocate throughout the tree. So an answer here to your question. So if you did cut stump treatments, you could come and harvest immediately afterwards. The herbicide's on the stump, it's moving into the root system somewhat. It may not be the most effective means, but you could come and harvest immediately. If you killed the beech, for example, and left them standing, maybe you did a basal bark treatment or a frill, an axe frill, and a hack and squirt treatment, you would need to leave those stand long enough till you actually saw the browning and wilting of the foliage and know that that herbicide was actually working and was translocated throughout that tree. So it might be months, for example, before you could come back and actually do the harvest and cut those down.
So Dave, I did some work with beech and cut stump treatments working in stands where the average beech diameter was over, I'll say 8 or 10 inches. And when we cut all of the beech larger than 6 inches in diameter and used glyphosate as a 25% active ingredient, we would control up to 90% of the beech suckers on those treated plots from the cut stump treatments. So I'm wondering if so maybe it depends a little bit on the size structure of the stand when you do the cut stump treatments, and we would get brown out of the root suckers usually within 4 or 5
very
weeks.
Effective in that sense. Now, I've worked specifically with tree of heaven down here and Atlantis. Okay,
Right, which I've never
and
worked with.
and we don't get
Right, I've never
control at
worked with
all
that.
on the root suckering. We can kill the top of the plant very easily um, through cut stump treatments, but the root suckering in the end of one growing season, you'll be right back to having 4-foot root suckers by the end of the first growing season with Atlantis. So
Hmm.
we don't get the translocation with a cut surface like that with a cut stump. So beech, it sounds like a little bit more effective
Hmm.
translocation through the root system there. Um, but I
Right.
guess I would. Sounds like you had great control. So I guess for beech that's a good practice. Then, Pete, I'm a little hesitant to cut that translocation system off in that tree. I like to keep that phloem intact and get that translocation down into the roots. You know, from the leaves down in the roots, it's those phloem cells, which is right below the bark, which is what's going to carry that down into the root system. And I like to keep that intact and keep that moving and translocate the product right through the root system. But sounds like you had good success.
Is that so, Dave? Is that when you're using a foliar
Well,
or a
it can be
basal
either,
bark
really. Really, what
that
I'm
you're?
referring to though is
Okay.
a frill girdle or basal bark treatment. I like I like to keep that
Okay.
top
Okay.
intact and really let that leaves in the phloem
Hmm.
cells, which are right beneath the bark, really keep that moving. So when I do a frill, for example, on a species like that, I don't do a complete frill. I don't girdle it completely because it's basically would be the same thing as if I cut the tree right off. So I like to leave spaces between my chops on the tree when I do a frill. And that way I have some of that phloem intact that keeps the top connected to the root system that way. And it allows for much better translocation.
Hmm. That's interesting because that's a really interesting observation because we've had a fair amount of discussion, I'll say, in New York on the Forest Connect Ning site about the effectiveness of the frill treatment to control sprouts. And some people have had good success and other people have had poor success. And I wonder if it depends upon how completely the circumference of the stem is girdled, and if there's better. What you're saying is that there's, and it makes sense when you
Right,
think about the
right.
physiology of the plant, that you're going to maintain that connection, particularly if you're working later in the season, and the plant and the beech will translocate
Yeah.
down into the root system.
And for
So, all right, let's
oh,
we
okay.
should probably move on. There are a lot of questions. Okay, Rebecca Hargrave provides a website, the PIMS website, for people in New York that want to be able to read a label before they buy a product, and they can go and check it out and see if the species that they want to control and the application method that they want to use is listed on the label. And Dave has similar kinds of information for Pennsylvania on his website. Every state is going to have something similar. Peter Collins says, what do you have to say about spraying and drainages going into protected trout streams?
Well, I think certainly in any situation we want to buffer streams as much as possible. But I will say this, the two of the products that I highlighted there are aquatic labeled products. So the rodeo, for example, which is the glyphosate product, has a full aquatic labeling on it. But at the same time, I think if we can buffer streams, so we're not managing in those buffers, maybe we're controlling invasives in those buffers, but beyond that, um, we can use products that are fully aquatic labeled. And those actually, in Pennsylvania, you need to have a permit to spray over water, but we can spray, stream banks as long as it's above the water line, and we can treat um, any problems that we might have there with these aquatic labeled products.
Okay. I guess that's also, maybe you mentioned this, that's also another good opportunity to use the integrated methods to minimize the amount of herbicides that you may need to
Yeah,
use.
absolutely.
Okay, so Tom says he's looking for a recommendation for control of Japanese knotweed.
Oh, well, there you go. We just talked about it. Japanese knotweed is generally going to grow along those stream banks, and it's a real problem. And it's just as prevalent in Ontario, Canada, as it is right down through Pennsylvania. And it's very susceptible to glyphosate type herbicides. Probably the most effective way to deal with Japanese knotweed is to cut it first. So if you can allow it to grow, we have a great fact sheet on that Penn State Vegetation Management research site on it. But essentially, it's cut it first, allow it to sprout up early summer, cut it down, let it resprout again. Now what it's done is it's really made that plant really utilize those stored root reserves because it's a perennial. It comes from the root systems annually. So when it sprouts up, cut it down, really drain those root reserves. Yeah, there it is, the bottom website there, the vm.cas. But let it really suck those root reserves out. Now when it regrows, it's not going to be able to grow nearly as tall as it could, because if this stuff just grows in the growing season, it can be 8-10 foot high. But if you've cut it first, let it resprout, now you've got some access where you can come in and you can treat it. And again, you can use an aquatic labeled product like Rodeo. If you're going to spray where it's getting into the water, it's probably a permitted process that you need to be involved in. But if you can spray it without getting it in the water, you can actually use that product like Rodeo and be very effective.
Okay, let's see. Page moves around, so I've lost track of where we were. Give me a second. All right, so Japanese knotweed. Caroline wants the research website, so that's posted. You can see that, and I added that as a hot link. So Jules, hi Jules, says, have there been any studies conducted to determine how soon you must treat after cutting for a cut stump with a water-soluble mixture?
No, basically it's just treat the freshly cut surface. And so basically it's cut it, set the chainsaw down and spray it. And that's a water-based mixture like a glyphosate, yeah.
All right. Miriam says, Dave, have you had any luck using grass pre-emergent on Japanese stilt grass? So pre-emergent herbicides.
Not specifically, yeah. Not specifically myself, personal applications, but I have worked with folks who have done those kinds of applications. You got to keep in mind that Japanese stilt grass is an annual grass, so it comes back from seed each year. So if we can treat it prior to it creating seed, we can treat it just as a foliar treatment using a glyphosate application. However, the fact of the matter is if it's gone to seed already in prior years, chances are there's a seed base already established in the soil that you're going to have to deplete. And so, for example, if you miss it just 1 year, it's creating seed and that seed is there. So you need to use that the Oust XP, for example. That's going to give you that soil activity that's going to affect that seed germination. And those can be very early treatments prior to that seed even germinating, that you can actually put that down over spots where you know the stiltgrass infestation is occurring. You'll see the dead brown grass there from the year before. And so that's a good way to treat it and keep it from coming back. But it's not a one and done kind of treatment, because you really have to burn out that seed bank that's there.
Okay. Robert wants to know, well, he wants you to cover the dilution percentages for various methods, which is probably more detail than what we can go into here. But does your website, Dave, go into the different dilution percentages for the different methods?
Yeah, it does, and that's where I was going to refer him to. So if you go to my website and look under chemical control, there's a table there that is entitled Herbicides by Application Method. And so you can look under all those individual methods, whether it's the cut stump or basal bark or the frill girdle treatments. It lists all the individual products that are labeled for that and what their rates of application are based on the label recommendations. And so that table is available for folks, Pete.
Okay, good. Beth asks about controlling Phragmites. If you have any experience with that or suggestions for that.
I don't, and I'm not sure if there's a publication available on that research site or not on Phragmites. I'm just looking here real quick to see if we have one I don't have any experience in that, Pete, and I don't see, just with a quick look here, I don't see a fact sheet on that, so I'm not sure I can help out with that one.
Okay. Lee asks, does basal bark really work all year long? He's concerned about difficult to kill species such as Ailanthus.
Okay, well, let's talk specifically then about Ailanthus, because Ailanthus is one of those that we cannot treat year-round no matter what method we're using, because Ailanthus is such a vigorous root-suckering tree. The best time to treat Ailanthus is late growing season. So late summer, early fall, prior to a frost, while the plant, you're talking about physiology, while the plant is still translocating, and particularly it's moving a lot of nutrients and sugars and starches and such down into the root system. And so late season applications on Ailanthus are a must. And I learned that personally the hard way through some of my work here, where you can kill the top of the tree very easily within a week. I thought, holy cow, this thing's dead. That was easy, no problem. Come back 2 years later and the infestation is just as strong and vigorous as it was when you started. And so, but late season applications, it's much more effective because you're going to get that translocation into the roots, which is absolutely necessary with Tree of Heaven.
What's a good product to use with that basal bark? I mean, you got to have a Garlon based product, right? Or a
Well,
triclopyr?
let's say triclopyr. So we're going to say the ester formulation of triclopyr. So the two primary products are going to be the Garland 4 or the Tahoe 4E, and the E stands for ester. So the Tahoe 4E is a new farm generic of the Garland 4, which is the DuPont product.
Okay.
Both of those are listed on that website. So you can look at basal bark and you can see what products are available for basal bark applications.
Okay. Jessica says she had asked about cutting the Russian olives on the border, and she wants to replant. How soon can she replant after the olives have been cut, followed up with herbicide use? And she's planning, it looks like, going to be able to directly treat the stem of the olives as they're cut. So any delay
Okay.
necessary before planting?
No, you're going to use backpack spray or a squirt bottle mixed with 50% glyphosate right out of the jug, 50% mixed with water. You're going to treat that cut surface so your treatment is exclusively on that stump. Essentially, you might get a little overspray, but there's no soil activity in glyphosate. It binds tightly to soil products or particles. It doesn't move off site. It's not taken up by root system of plants, so you could plant immediately in there. You wouldn't have any worries of any kind of problems there.
Okay. Fred is asking about experience with glyphosate translocating to adjacent trees via root grafts after you've done a cut stump treatment. And he had some experience where he treated some Norway maples and then had nearby Norway maples die following the cut stump treatment.
Yes, yeah, you do have to be careful with that. Glyphosate is easily translocated through root systems, where I've found that Garland 4 or triclopyr, for example, is very little translocation from tree to tree that way. But glyphosate's a different story, and you can have some flashover. And particularly, in my experience, was with white pine, for example, trying to release and do more of a pre-commercial kind of thinning in white pine. So I was controlling white pine with a frill girdle and ended up killing the crop tree in one instance. So yeah, absolutely. You have to be careful if you're doing that kind of treatment, particularly species to species, same species to same species. I think you're going to have more effect. So if you were controlling Norway maple, but you had a different species around it, I'd say chances of that kind of flashover would be slim to none. But if you were controlling Norway maple and trying to leave Norway maple, chances are you're going to see some of that, which by the way, Norway maple is listed as invasive, so we should just get rid of the Norway maple and put something native in there anyway. So
which I think Fred had recognized, but he was just noting that because of that translocation, they had to deal then with removing dead trees. So it was a management cost. So
Yeah.
okay.
Yep, you have to be careful there. Absolutely, that's definitely a point of warning.
So Rebecca Hargrave points out that New York will soon have a Phragmites fact sheet. It's in review now, and it's going to be posted at NYIS, which is New York Invasive Species, NYIS.info. Related to that, Caroline says there's a Phragmites fact sheet at the Penn State Horticulture site, and she provides a link for that I won't try to respond to. Robert's asking about controlling swallowwort, and if there are fact sheets on that, or if that's something that's covered on your website.
I'm not familiar with that, Pete. I'm not sure what that plant is, to be perfectly honest with you.
We have we have
and Rebecca's right. I'm sorry, I did miss that fact that I just looked back here. So there is one on the Penn State site on Phragmites. The common reed is listed under the State Parks Invasive Species Management quick sheet. So, so Arkover does have one on that. But no, I'm not familiar with that plant, Pete.
Okay, so the swallowwort is occurring in New York, and I'd have to reread my labels every year because I can't remember which species match with which pesticide formulations. There are some TUI exemptions that are available to control swallowwort, but you'll have to look or contact somebody, and I'll find that information and put it up on the Ning site as well. Okay. Oh, and Rebecca has a link for a swallowwort website at the National Park Service.
Oh, okay.
And Tim talks about using a glyphosate-based product for black swallowwort. Okay, well, and then there was lots of people saying, "Great job, Dave," and I'll echo that. We're at 125, and Dave has done a fabulous job of bringing this topic to light, and I'd like to thank all of you who've been able to stick around. We had maximum capacity, so that's a testimony to the topic and to Dave's presentation. So let's I'll thank Dave, and we'll be welcoming Dave back again tonight at 7 p.m. and remind all of you next month's presentations by Rebecca Hargrave looking at the pests of forest trees. So thank you all, and I'll look through some of these. I see some comments on buckthorn. I'll try and do some updates onto the Forest Connect Ning site as well. So thank you all, and thank you, Dave. We'll see you back here tonight.
Okay, thanks a lot, Pete. Appreciate it. Yep, we'll see you tonight then.
Thank you.